The sack of Rome in 1527 marked a dramatic and symbolic end to the High Renaissance, and profoundly impacted both the Italian Peninsula and broader European politics. Carried out by mutinous troops of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, the event was characterized by violence, destruction, and the suffering of the Eternal City. While rooted in the politics of the Italian Wars and the rivalry between Charles V and Francis I of France, the sack of Rome also had deeper religious, social, and cultural implications. The early 16th century was a time of extraordinary turmoil in Europe, as the Italian Wars, 1494 to 1559, pitted powerful states and rulers against one another for dominance in Italy. At the heart of this conflict was the rivalry between Charles V and Francis I of France. Both monarchs sought to control Italian territories, particularly Milan and Naples, which were seen as key to their broader imperial ambitions. Italy's fragmented political landscape, divided among competing city-states, papal territories, and foreign powers, provided fertile ground for conflict. Pope Clement VII, a Medici pope, attempted to navigate this complex geopolitical situation by shifting alliances. Initially siding with Charles V, Clement grew alarmed by the emperor's growing dominance in Italy, and ultimately joined the League of Cognac, an anti-imperial alliance with France, Venice, Florence, and Milan. This move antagonized Charles V, who saw it as a betrayal. Religious tensions further exacerbated the situation. By 1527, the Protestant Reformation was spreading across Europe, challenging the Catholic Church's authority. While Charles V was a staunch Catholic, his control over Germany required him to tolerate Lutheran princes, creating an uneasy balance. Pope Clement VII's opposition to Charles's ambitions created a rift between the spiritual and secular heads of Catholic Europe, further destabilizing the region. The immediate cause of the sack of Rome was the financial desperation of Charles V's armies. After his victory over Francis I at the Battle of Pavia, 1525, Charles faced enormous debts. His unpaid troops, a mix of Spanish soldiers, German Landsknechte, many of whom were Protestant, and Italian mercenaries, grew increasingly mutinous. Under the command of Charles III, Duke of Bourbon, these troops marched toward Rome in early 1527, largely without direct orders from Charles V. On May 6, 1527, the imperial army breached Rome's walls after a brief but intense siege. The death of Charles III during the assault left the undisciplined troops without leadership, plunging the city into chaos. Over the next several days, Rome was subjected to an unprecedented level of violence, looting, and destruction. Churches, palaces, and homes were pillaged, while civilians were raped, murdered, or held for ransom. Even sacred spaces such as St. Peter's Basilica were desecrated, as Protestant soldiers mocked Catholic rituals and relics. The Pope himself was forced to seek refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo, a fortress near the Vatican. Besieged for weeks, Clement eventually surrendered and paid a hefty ransom for his release, effectively becoming a prisoner of Charles's forces. The city's population, estimated at 55,000 before the sack, was reduced by half due to slaughter, starvation, and disease. The sack of Rome marked a decisive shift in the balance of power in Italy and Europe. Charles V's domination of the Italian Peninsula became uncontested following the Pope's capitulation. The League of Cognac disintegrated, and Charles solidified his control over Naples and Milan, ensuring Habsburg hegemony in Italy for decades. For Pope Clement VII, the sack was a personal and political disaster. He emerged weakened, both financially and morally, and was compelled to crown Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor in Bologna in 1530, effectively recognizing the emperor's supremacy. This event also signaled the decline of Italian city-states as independent powers. Florence, Venice, and other republics became increasingly marginalized in European politics, as Spain and the Holy Roman Empire consolidated control over Italy. The sack underscored the vulnerability of the papacy and the Italian Peninsula, setting the stage for the Counter-Reformation and Spain's central role in defending Catholicism. The religious implications of the sack were profound. For many contemporaries, the sack was seen as divine punishment for the corruption and moral decay of the Catholic Church and its leaders. Protestant reformers interpreted the event as evidence of God's wrath against the Pope, whom they viewed as a symbol of decadence and tyranny. The desecration of sacred sites by imperial troops, many of whom were Protestant, highlighted the deepening religious divisions within Europe. For the Catholic Church, the sack of Rome served as a wake-up call. Although it took several decades, the trauma of 1527 contributed to the sense of urgency that led to the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, and the Counter-Reformation. The Church began to implement reforms aimed at addressing corruption, strengthening clerical discipline, and countering Protestantism. The cultural consequences of the sack were equally significant. Rome, the heart of the Renaissance and a center of artistic and intellectual life, was left in ruins. Many artists and scholars fled the city, dispersing Renaissance ideas across Europe, but also signaling the decline of Rome's preeminence as a cultural hub. The sack marked the end of the High Renaissance and ushered in a period of mannerism, characterized by a darker, more anxious aesthetic that reflected the uncertainty and violence of the time. One of the most poignant symbols of the sack's impact on culture was the plight of Benvenuto Cellini, a goldsmith and sculptor who participated in the defense of Rome. His later works and memoirs convey the chaos and trauma of the event. Similarly, artists such as Michelangelo and Raphael were deeply affected by the instability of the period, which influenced their later works. The sack of Rome in 1527 is often regarded as a turning point in early modern history, symbolizing the end of one era and the beginning of another. Politically, it underscored the rise of powerful centralized states and the decline of fragmented polities like the Italian city-states. Religiously, it foreshadowed the Catholic Church's efforts to respond to the Protestant Reformation and reassert its authority. Culturally, it marked the transition from the optimism and grandeur of the Renaissance to the more somber and introspective tone of mannerism and Baroque art. While the sack was a catastrophe for Rome, it also reflected broader trends in European history. The rise of imperial powers, the fracturing of Christendom, and the militarization of politics were all central features of the 16th century. The sack demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most sacred and iconic cities in the face of these forces, a reminder of the unpredictable and often destructive nature of historical change. The sack of Rome by Charles V's forces in 1527 was a watershed moment in European history, with profound political, religious, and cultural consequences. Rooted in the rivalries and tensions of the Italian wars, the event represented the culmination of the conflict between Charles V and Pope Clement VII, while also highlighting the broader instability of Renaissance Europe. The destruction of Rome marked the end of the city's Renaissance glory and heralded a new era of religious and political realignments. Despite its devastating effects, the sack served as a catalyst for change, forcing the Catholic Church and European powers to adapt to a rapidly evolving world. In this sense, the sack of Rome stands as a defining episode in the transition from the medieval to the modern era.